Welcome back to Second Breakfast. I wanted to do a little follow-up to our Jack White no-name discussion from a couple weeks ago. And this is inspired by some similar themes and ideas that I felt listening to Eminem's new album, The Death of Slim Shady. It's kind of remarkable timing that you have these two throwback Detroit-based artists both reckoning with their evolving artistic identities. And I was sort of continuing to chew on the Jack White album while listening to the Eminem album. The approaches that these two artists take could not be more different, where Eminem literally, physically, personally revives his old persona in order to critique and parody him. I wouldn't say there's a real effort to kill him off. I think he's more reckoning with those two identities, but I wouldn't be surprised if the character shows up in the future. If anything, this feels like a demotion from his chief ulterior personality to one of the many characters that he can rope in the future. But I thought it was a fascinating reckoning of an artist many years into their career, revisiting their earlier work and grappling with it in real time, giving voice to different eras of your creative output. I think it's a really rewarding project the more you listen to it. And then going back to No Name, which I've been listening to sort of nonstop, I think Jack White is doing something very different. Neither one is better or worse, but the gulf between them has broken through some new insights for me about Jack White's No Name, because that album is never a parody of his early work. That is not an imitation of the White Stripes. It's not a critique of his earlier work. It's not this almost ironic doing what the fans want that sometimes the Slim Shady thing leans into. There's a resentment somewhat that I get in Eminem having to return to this character. But for Jack White, I think this is a sincere personal reckoning. Now that the album is officially out, we have some confirmation, we have some details cleared up. First of all, the album is now officially called No Name, and it has that completely unmarked blue cover. The only words on the physical record are on the spine, where the title is written, the words No Name, and the artist name Jack White is there, but it's crossed out. And this production design really crystallizes some of the ideas Maggie and I were playing with in our last Jack White episode here, where we were throwing out this idea that No Name is just as much about the album's artist as it is about the album's title, where there's a silent resurrection happening here, a reckoning of, almost a rejection of artistic identity. And looking back across his solo career, that's the thrust of what this episode's going to be about. We're going to go through basically the artwork of his solo career, the album art, and I think we're going to glean a lot of information and evolution through sort of simple imagery comparisons. But I would say that the flashpoint moment that we're going to talk about begins on Fear of the Dawn, which is his fourth solo album. And it's particularly on that album's closer. Maggie and I were on a road trip the other day, and basically I played my favorite songs from every Jack White solo album in order. I know it's an unbelievable treat to be married to me, but she seemed to enjoy most of it. I'm joking, of course. She's been to multiple Jack shows with me, and she's a devoted fan. You should have seen her at the last Jack concert. She was losing it just as much as I was, but I think we were both struck upon this sort of sequential revisiting. We were both struck by the closer of Fear of the Dawn, which is absolutely, for the time, it was Jack White's straightest blues song in 10 years. That was 10 years into his solo career when Fear of the Dawn came out. And that last song is called Shedding My Velvet. So there's an element of that artistic identity, that evolution, all of that is being engaged not just in the reversion and genre of this song coming as a curveball at the end of a hard rock album, but it's right there in the title as well. And going through all of these albums in order again, I think in retrospect, that song really does feel like the singular moment, the singular song that breaks everything open and really began this process of welcoming back the old Jack White and kicked off this 3-album cycle, which has just been exploded in the finale of No Name, this 3-album cycle of blending that old Jack White with the new Jack White. And yes, just to preamble it, just to disclaim it here sort of at the beginning, The details are incredibly intentional. I think any Jack White fan will know how important little details and motifs and quirks and rules are to him, which means that this sort of close reading, I think, is incredibly valid. I mean, down to everyone knows how much he cares about the number 3. Everyone knows about the basic color theory of his bands. There's an intentionality, there's a secrecy, a detail to basically everything that comes out of Third Man, down to the uniforms. I mean, I could list 12 other anecdotes, but I'll stop myself there. But the basic color theory would be the yellow of the Dead Weather, the green of the Raconteurs, the red of the White Stripes, the blue of his solo stuff. It all starts, all of that color theory, all of this detail and intentionality. Musically, I think that starts with the all red of the White Stripes. It's red, white, and black, but red is the individual outlier that signifies that band. And when that band ended, which was not Jack's decision, and he's said in multiple interviews that he would have continued in that band making albums as the White Stripes for the rest of his life. When that band ends, as it's on this absolute, I mean, really hit its stride. I mean, I love every single album that the White Stripes put out, but I think Icky Thump is just unbelievably them hitting their stride and fulfilling every promise that you could hear or feel in every other song we recorded. I think that is such a tour de force of an album. So to end that band on that note where it felt like the sky was the limit and you didn't even know what would come next, it's interesting how hard the tone changes. So the band that is defined by the red is over, and he pivots to the opposite. The tone shifts, the genre shifts, and the color shifts from red to its opposite, blue. And this is where we start with Blunderbuss, which is sort of the beginning of the Nashville era of Jack White. You've got some country stuff, you've got some folk stuff. It's very different from that garage blues punky feel that you got from the White Stripes. So hard shift in artistic direction. I think there's a fascinating energy and emotion and almost anger that I sense throughout that album. But looking back at the cover, I think you can see in this album cover that something's going on here in this sort of not intentionally evolving artistic identity, sort of circumstances outside his control. There's an element of reaction throughout this initial streak of Jack's solo career, where he is represented on this photograph that makes up the cover. He's in black and white, and he's surrounded by this wash of blue in this sort of barren, fuzzy, industrial landscape. And for this first effort of the blue era, in the same way we talk about the blue era of other artists meaning some sort of grief or sadness or depression, I think that's an easy shorthand that at the time, because I've been on this roller coaster for a long time, I read that blue almost literally as a sort of grief. Ironically, he turned to the color blue when he was moving away from the genre blues, but yes, I do think the blue reads as a sort of grief on the Blunderbuss album cover, and of course he's got a vulture on his shoulder and he's looking away from the camera. So there is a moodiness, there is a sadness that leans into the blue on that first album. And then 2 years later, when we move to his next solo album, Lazaretto, the same colors and the same elements are there, but they've all evolved a little. So there's still a photograph, there's still Jack White on the cover, but instead of kind of hunched and avoiding the camera, his face is unchanged. It's in the exact same position. You could almost layer them on top of each other and it would be identical, but his pose is different. His clothing is different. It's not just this muted black and white outfit that he's wearing, almost like a black overcoat in that Blunderbuss photo, but in Lazaretto, he's in a blue suit. And he's reclining on this chair in a way that looks like Game of Thrones, like he's reclining on a throne. So everything has changed and everything has stayed the same, but he's embracing some of that blue. Instead of it surrounding him as this little black and white island in the middle of the Blunderbuss cover, here the blue has started to permeate him. He's wearing the blue. He's embracing it, embracing that solitude of this burgeoning solo career. And instead of having a vulture on his shoulder, he's surrounded by angels. You see how it's an evolution of imagery more than it's a total reinvention. This is not distinct reinvented eras of a career that Maggie's talked about Taylor Swift before. This isn't that extreme of a redefinition. It's more of a shifted perspective. He's embracing the blue. He's leaning in, and instead of a vulture, he's moved to angels. There's an advancement of imagery more than we've totally shaken up the snow globe here. And then we get to the curveball. And this is the third album, Boarding House Reach, which I have been wrestling with since it came out. And I think that's a testament to a work of art, if it can be that engaging and challenging for that long. And this one breaks many of the conventions that we've established thus far in Jack White's solo career. It's the first non-photo album cover. And hey, Jack isn't there at all. So this is interesting as almost a disappearing act, because with Jack gone and literally out of the picture, when we return to the imagery in the first two albums, there's the vulture from Blunderbuss and the angels from Lazaretto. Maybe you could say that with that sort of funerary ascension over those two albums, maybe if Jack is gone, he's ascended with the angels. Maybe he's moved past grieving who he used to be in his previous career and musical identity. I think you can read all that into it. But the music has such a fever on this album. It is so spirited and strange and different. It's the wildest departure he's ever taken, I would argue, across any of his many bands or musical identities. But it's not blank. It's not just blue, like we'll talk about later with No Name. There's a face on this cover. And instead of Jack, it's this sort of amorphous figure who's almost genderless, but I would say leans more feminine. So it's Jack being replaced with this woman. And it's not quite a photograph. It looks more artificial than that. But there's something recognizable about the figure because it has adopted his pose, that very pointed, dour tilt of the head from the Blunderbuss cover, from the Lazaretto cover. And the face is rendered in black and white in the same way Jack's face is rendered on those earlier two covers and surrounded by this blue exterior. So there's a continuity in these album covers, even though you're changing all the elements. It's not a photo, Jack's not even there, but there's still a continuity. In the same way, paradoxically, that there's a continuity even when you look him up on Spotify and you go chronologically through his albums. He continues after the White Stripes ends. And that sort of begrudging afterlife seems to be embodied artistically through these covers. We know many of the artists, many of the photographers he works with, I think it would be a discredit to them to not dig into the symbolism of all of this. But that almost unbroken continuity, even though you change out all the parts, everything's still the same. I think that speaks to the loss and the graduation past the White Stripes career. In the same way his career continued, but without Meg. It's this uneasy evolution. And if you want to read into the gendered aspect of it, of course, there is precedent throughout Jack White's career of him singing from a woman's POV and sort of not really minding any of those swaps or changes. So there's something amorphous built into his identity as an artist. But there's a freedom to this image because it is not a straight photograph. It does things that are more surreal. For example, the head is basically opened up. It looks like the part where the brain would be is where the image is cracked open, and almost like a watercolor, it bleeds or flows through the top of the image and drifts away into this blue sky. And this is what continues the color coding of the solo career, but also returns to engaging his presence in his identity, this disappearing act that I referenced earlier. I feel like this is the moment of that most explicit engagement, because in Lazaretto and Blunderbuss, the black and white of Jack was pretty neatly demarcated between that and the presence of any blue in the image. And you saw in Blunderbuss, he was black and white, everything else was blue. Lazaretto, he wears the blue suit, but the rest of him is still in this forlorn black and white. And here there's a face that isn't his own, that is black and white, but it opens up and the mind is rendered in blue. So we're blurring these lines. We're almost confronting the idea that there is this division between the blue coding of a solo career and the black and white picture of the artists themselves. And I love how mercurial that is. I love that there aren't any easy answers in picking apart the Boarding House Reach cover, because I find the album itself similarly complex in that I keep having to engage with it from these different angles over the many years since it was released. Even seeing him on the tour for that album, it made more sense to me, but I still find it one of the most enigmatic and challenging works that he's ever put out. And then a few years later, we get his fourth album, Fear of the Dawn. That's the one I talked about earlier, that at the very end, the closing track is that shockingly straightforward blues song, Shedding My Velvet, that felt like the watershed moment that sparked a lot of these ideas. But just looking at the cover art for Fear of the Dawn, I would argue that it restates the relationship that I've laid out in the previous three album covers, where we're still externalizing the color blue, but sort of struggling with that bleeding into the identity of the black and white rendering of Jack White. Here we have blue as this fading night sky in the background of the image, and we don't return to the photography of Blunderbuss or Lazaretto. We continue with that strange rendered, drawn quality of Boarding House Reach. But this time, we're not dealing with this sort of amorphous, genderless representation. We have Jack White here, but not in a photograph. So we're continuing these ideas. We're evolving. We're twisting the dial further. But he's turned even more away from the camera. So there's this engagement and closer intimacy and proximity while he's pulling back, while he's being more reserved. It's that tension, it's that contradiction and struggle that I think has beautifully defined so much of this solo career so far. Some of the images return, I think, from the earlier album covers in new and sort of provocative ways. Blunderbuss's vultures, that big vulture that was sitting on his shoulder in that album cover, I feel like that returns, the metaphor of the vulture returns through the wreckage of the house that Jack is standing in front of, and the car behind him, because he's holding this suit jacket and this house has been destroyed. The car behind him starts to look like a hearse. So we're leaning back into that bluesy, the feeling, not the genre. We're leaning back into that the blue feeling of Blunderbuss, that reaction to the end of the White Stripes and the begrudging launch of a solo career. There is that funerary energy that comes roiling back on Fear of the Dawn. And if the vultures used to represent death, now applying that death between the hearse of the car and the funeral suit and this downcast look, applying that to the metaphor of the house has an interesting thematic resonance back through the White Stripes. Because one of their songs, I believe it was on the second album, is called Let's Build a Home. And then the second album of Jack White's solo career, Lazaretto, has a song called Alone in My Home. And now, even more albums, even more years later, he's standing in front of this destroyed house. There is this sort of delayed, put-off reckoning with this loss, and you can track that back through almost two distinct artistic careers. A lot of these ideas are made visible on the album cover of Fear of the Dawn through the color theory, if we can return to that idea from the previous albums. All of that comes roaring back here, but with a new wrinkle. Because you'll remember the way we talked about it. Jack was just black and white and uncomfortable alone in the Blunderbuss cover. And then in the Lazaretto cover, he seemed to have embraced some of that imagery, some of that new blue identity by wearing that blue suit. And then he's absent entirely from Boarding House Reach, and we play with this thought experiment of continuity with a new face and returning imagery, but he's gone. We've swapped out essential parts, and somehow something still remains. There's a Ship of Theseus quality to Boarding House Reach. But the new wrinkle in Fear of the Dawn is that he's embraced the blue even more, and it's not a passive choice like putting on a suit jacket that you could take off just as easily. Here in this image, which isn't a photograph, which makes everything look more permanent, more bold, more striking, his hair is blue as well. So the blue has become part of him, part of his body. And more particularly, if we go back to that boarding house reach image where the blue was the flyaway, opened up blue sky where the brain would be on the figure, here we have blue right where Jack's brain would be. There's this idea of this color theory literally on his mind. This solo career, these identities, they're literally telegraphed on his mind with the blue hair on his head. But instead of having that cracked open, wild energy of boarding house reach with that blue open sky, here there's something contained. The blue is in the background like it would be at night, and then it is just on his hair. So there's order being restored versus the sort of chaotic beauty of boarding house reach. Something has been tethered, something has been controlled, and now it's part of him. I think he's taken control of that evolving identity. There's a unity between the black, the white, and the blue. They're mixing more than they ever have. And I think the musical energy of Fear of the Dawn, it feels more in line with some of that earlier work, more in line with something like Elephant, say, where there is the hybrid identity. You can feel some of that bluesy, punky, real rock energy come back into the music. So the hybrid identity isn't just about the album cover. It's not just about the imagery or the aesthetics or the negotiation of the color theory. It's also about the music. And this is the gorgeous kind of compounding resonance throughout this career that I find so interesting to stare at. Jack is known so much for being a champion of vinyl records, and that doesn't just mean the record you put on the turntable. That means while you're listening to his music, which is mixed and produced so beautifully for that format, you have this 12-inch by 12-inch sleeve with this beautifully rendered cover to look at, to think about. You have a lyric sheet, and I think there's a depth in these cover images that deserves that level of attention. For any other album you'd listen to, say on Spotify or Apple Music, you're not going to print out a 12 by 12 inch poster of the album art to engage with. But I think there really is that attention to detail. The patterns, the breaks from the patterns, the rules, the rebellions, it's all there, and it always has been. I could do one of these episodes about any of the bands he's been in. Maybe I will. But for now, let's move to the next solo album, which is another amazing curveball, Entering Heaven Alive. And I want to start with the title there because there's something immediately reflective. There's something thoughtful and passive and beautiful, almost like this divergent solo identity that he was forced into. This blue era is taking Dante's grand tour. We're doing that divine comedy thing of walking through the different realms of the afterlife. And the title, dropping that religion reference with Entering Heaven Alive, evoking heaven, recalls for me Lazaretto and the angel statues. So not actual angels, but representations, calcifications of angels watching him in Lazaretto. At this point in the solo career, I feel like we've gotten deep enough, we've gotten introspective enough that Jack feels like one of those angels. And I think this album is a reaction to Fear of the Dawn. It's a doubling down on those difficult themes and challenging introspections in the very same way Lazaretto was to Blunderbuss. It's these beautiful sort of couplet relationships that you can chart through the solo career. And in the same way, Fear of the Dawn recalled Blunderbuss's despondent funerary exterior with the suit jacket, with the broken house, with the car that looked like a hearse. We're continuing that. We're escalating that. Instead of funerary themes, we're in the afterlife now. We're calling that bluff and seeing what's next. Moving to the cover art itself for Entering Heaven Alive, I think we have another layered evolution of imagery. So you have the pose, that like almost 90-degree turn pose that Jack had on the Fear of the Dawn cover, but it's not him in the picture anymore. We're doing the thing he did in Boarding House Reach, where he was swapped out for this more feminine face. So we're already pulling Fear of the Dawn and Boarding House Reach. Just on first glance, those images are being changed and twisted and combined in this cover for Entering Heaven Alive. It's compounding levels of reaction and iteration building throughout this solo career. It's this long, difficult meditation that I really just admire and find so provocative. But playing with a couple other visual details here. The background is this black and white. It looks like these threads or stripes. And for me, it recalls that black and white, stripy, almost visual clutter of all of the pieces of the house that has fallen down around him in Fear of the Dawn. And I think that evoking Fear of the Dawn on the very next album gives you that really strong visual continuity. But if you look at the action the woman is taking, it almost looks like she's working a loom. It looks like she's building something, which is another level of reaction to Fear of the Dawn, where it looks like a house has been knocked down. Here we see someone rebuilding, possibly putting these pieces back together. And it's very possible that someone is the female figure from Boarding House Reach. So you have this cooperation across artistic eras. Or even, given the title of Entering Heaven Alive, maybe that woman isn't the woman from Boarding House Reach. Maybe it's one of those angels from Lazaretto. Or even because this is one figure with this sort of faded, indistinct industrial background, it also looks like a recreation of the Blunderbuss cover. But there are even more interesting wrinkles hidden inside this Entering Heaven Alive album cover within the color theory. Because obviously, I'm sure this is the first thing you noticed when you looked at it. Entering Heaven Alive is the first and only Jack White solo album without any blue on the cover. So it's breaking one of those cardinal rules of art direction that he's followed for 10 plus years at this point throughout his solo career. And without the blue, we are just left with black and white. And if you pull right back to the beginning of what we started talking about with Blunderbuss, the background was blue, but Jack himself was rendered in black and white there. So there is this, again, explosion of identity of what if I just put the spotlight on me and not even the way I've chosen to make sense of and define this era? What if it's just on me and I don't have any of those motifs to lean back on? We just have the black and the white. And the white is interesting because, of course, his first massive band, the White Stripes, the color theory is right there in the name. It's been part of this journey the whole time. But Entering Heaven Alive is interesting because even more than Fear of the Dawn evokes a lot of that White Stripes, we get back to some of those genres and feelings. Entering Heaven Alive revives that acoustic songwriter purity of his earliest work, which was defined by its simplicity. The White Stripes just had Meg White's unbelievable, powerful, primal, simplistic drum work, Jack's squealing, soaring guitar work, and his voice. Just three elements at any given time. And here we strip everything back after this explosive, computer, deep-fried, explosion, fuzzy, amazing Fear of the Dawn. All of that is gone on Entering Heaven Alive, and we pull back to that almost Delta blues simplicity, which has influenced so much of Jack's career. So I think the absence of the color blue also represents the absence of so many of the musical influence that have, up until this point, defined that solo career. So as the blue started to fade away and be made sense of on Fear of the Dawn, now it's entirely gone in Entering Heaven Alive, and the thing that's left is something incredibly resonant of that early work. The second White Stripes album was recorded in their living room. It's a blues album recorded in their living room. You can't get more stripped down and pure and simple than that. And there's a lot of that energy on Entering Heaven Alive, which comes after the cannon blast of Shedding My Velvet, which is this blues reversion at the end of Fear of the Dawn. And these two albums set us up perfectly for No Name. Now that we've built through these previous 5 solo albums, we can talk about No Name with, I think, more context, even beyond having the album officially released, where we have the album art, where we have the official name. Musically, now that I've listened to it 100,000 times, No Name is the fullest return to that old early Jack White, White Stripes style. So you'd think, based on the conversation we just had about Entering Heaven Alive, you'd think that we'd continue and this album would just be black and white, right? But no. The blue comes roaring back here. And it doesn't just return in a background or in a suit or part of his person that he's trying to absorb. The blue is the only thing we get. The blue swallows up everything, even Jack White, even the woman that we've seen on Boarding House Reach or Entering Heaven Alive. There's nothing except for the blue. This is another disappearing act, and this one is so much larger than the last effort because it is so complete. There is no substitute. There's no anyone else. There's no imagery or symbol to dig into. There's him, and there's the color theory that has so prominently defined so many eras of his life and career. And my immediate read of this, once we got confirmation that this chunk of sort of fractured blue was the official album cover, it felt like we were wiping the slate clean. It almost felt like, with all of these motifs and ideas and carefully plotted and planned details, if you get rid of all of that, if you just shake the Etch-a-Sketch until all of it goes away, it's almost the sign of an artist getting out of their own way and abandoning the rules or creative limitations and just firing something out into the world. It reads to me now, after staring at these 6 images for a long time, as almost a reset of Jack White's artistic identity. He's not, he's the guy who was one half of the White Stripes. He's not, he's solo Jack White, 6 albums deep into his solo career. It's just an album that someone hands you. You have a reaction to the color blue, you put it on the turntable, you hear that riff, and you lock into those details. So there's an absence here. There's that disappearing act that I defined earlier. It's that Jack is all of this. He's always been everything in the image. It's not just the pictures of him that are him on the album covers. This is a self-titled band that it's a solo project. He is the blue as well. He's the background. He's the vulture. He's the angels. He's the colors. He's all of it. So if you look at Boarding House Reach, he's not on that cover. There's a woman. There's a blue sky. But he is that too. He is that restless, exploded mind. He's that blue sky on Boarding House Reach. He's all of these elements. So by returning the colors back to basics and just throwing that color theory at you, this symbol that represents his solo career, and abandoning all the other imagery, the funerary stuff, the angels, the vultures, we're left with something that feels incredibly profound. There's no more division between Jack White and the blue of this solo career era. Remember back on Blunderbuss, on his first solo album, there was Jack rendered in the middle, isolated, looking almost uncomfortable in black and white, and surrounding him was this blue that felt like a grieving process, that felt like he was thrust into this new reality out of his control. But all of those divisions are gone here. The way I just laid it out, every album cover for a musician is some kind of self-portrait, right? Even if it doesn't have a photo of them on it. It's a companion to their music. It is still an expression of themselves, and it becomes the thumbnail, the identifier for that immaterial music. This album feels like Jack finally reckoning with that and tearing down all those walls that would have separated who he is, the thing that is Jack White that permeates throughout any band that he's in. I think it's him breaking down that last wall between that almost eternal form of Jack White and this solo career, because the blue was always something on the outside before. It was outside and surrounding him almost threateningly on Blunderbuss, and then we saw these flirtations with it through subsequent albums where the blue was on his suit and it was like he was trying to embrace it, or the blue was in his hair and that was on his mind. But that's finally broken down now. It's an interesting companion piece that on Entering Heaven Alive, you have just the black and white and no Jack. And then on No Name, you have just the blue and no Jack. I think he's experimenting with taking these symbols, taking these elements that have defined this solo career a la carte, and you toy with them, and it doesn't matter which ones you pull out or which ones you bring to prominence, he's still there. But this total removal, this total minimalism, feels like a moment of ultimate reckoning, that we're finally breaking down those barriers. The blue is not the negative space. The blue is not the background. The blue is not this invading force that he's trying to graft onto his body and his identity. The blue is him. The blue is everything we see. There has been that reckoning, and I think the ease of the album, the lack of rules, almost the lack of gloss and polish and production, speaks to sort of a freedom, an embrace that we haven't felt so far in this solo career. Even the cover image is sort of lo-fi and almost impromptu. It's not the result of some beautiful, intricate photo shoot. It's not a work of art that has been created and grafted and messed with like Fear of the Dawn and Boarding House Reach. This feels sort of slapdash and rushed, and almost there's that push to not overthink, to not overproduce, to get at something more immediate, because these rules are extraordinarily rigid, and I've always admired that about Jack White, regardless of the band he's in, even down to how Third Man Records is operated. That's his label, and of course it has those multiple storefronts. But if you look at how he dresses on stage, it's always intricately woven within the color scheme of the band. He's got blue accents, he's got the black and white. Even the gear, he'll have guitars that are specifically coded to the right color of the band. He had that famous red guitar that he played with the white stripes. And now I saw a video of him, which in itself represents sort of a break from the rules, because the last number of tours, he's had those yonder pouches where when you enter the venue, you put your phone in a little locked bag so everyone is present and part of the experience, which I also love, but it does represent that sort of overbearing role of rules, the strictness around the creative expression. I saw a shaky cell phone video of Jack White playing some of these new songs wearing a red long-sleeve shirt. I have not seen him wear red on stage since the White Stripes. So do you see what I'm saying here? There is this breakdown of the rules. There is this re-emergence of something more simple, something more timeless that feels like it is of that earlier age, because every other element has been stripped back. Every other symbol is gone. You look at this block of scratchy blue color and you still see Jack White. And more than that, you see all of him, past and present. You reflect on your experiences with his music. The first time you heard Seven Nation Army at a sports game, there's so much there. You see his whole solo career, but even more than that, without any sort of prompt, you see all of his careers at the same time. We're evoking the blue, but just the blue. We're not leading you in any other direction. It is evoking his artistic lineage without any limitation on those memories. This album cover is a playful mystery. It's a puzzle without a picture on the box telling you what it's going to look like. And instead of building towards that specific picture, you create. You have an unprecedented amount of agency when engaging with this album, because you are not told the details of what to think or what it's called. You're giving the little provocation with the name being crossed out, and then just this swath of blue to make sense of. So you go looking for clues. You're more active when you notice lyrical motifs, like I played with on our previous episode. You notice the guitar tone. Hey, that sounds more like the White Stripes, but not quite like that too. There's still some Fear of the Dawn there. There's this negotiation of artistic identities. You are set down the garden path of those conversations. You notice his vocal style recalls the innocence of his earlier work, but there's this gruff, aged quality too, and a desperation, a beauty, a struggle to the delivery. No Name is an invitation. It is a magic trick that I still can't see the strings of. It's a puppet without strings. It is a provocation. And I think my lasting impression, because I've consumed this work so completely since it has come out, it really does feel like an artist reckoning with his colorful, literally past, and more importantly, his present work. And for the first time in the solo career that I've paid such attention to over the last 12 years, I feel like he's really looking towards his future, which is really fitting because this 6th solo album matches an important milestone for the White Stripes. And of course, critically, commercially, musically, most people seem to think that was his best work, and that is the shadow that overlays everything else he will make. That is the comparison everyone else makes to everything, every single thing he tries to put out into the world now. But as of No Name, he's officially had as many solo albums as he had albums with the White Stripes. So we're matching that milestone. We've fulfilled that contract. We seem to have, I imagine if you look at the shelf, we've escaped the shadow of that. He's equaled that achievement on his own. And the symmetry here is just irresistible. The White Stripes' career begins with a self-titled album, The White Stripes, and it's that title, it's that name of the artist that follows or haunts Jack for his entire career. That is the benchmark. That is the thing that every future project is compared to. That's the first line of the obituary. That is the shadow we're talking about. And then as he matches that achievement in his solo career, he comes full circle. But instead of having a self-titled album there to balance out, to close that couplet, he calls it No Name and has his name there with a line through it. He's completing that idea. He's exploding that idea and moving on from it. Artistically, it feels like he's coming to terms with that legacy. He's embracing it, rejecting it, grappling with it, struggling with it, and now he's surpassing it. And whatever happens next, whatever album comes next, it feels like we've finally moved out from that shadow. And despite this album representing an abandon, an explosion of so many of the rules we've talked about here, it's interesting that it also represents the completion of a 3-album cycle. I talked about how important the number 3 was to him before, and I've even hinted at it throughout this discussion. Blunderbuss, Lazaretto, Boarding House Reach. There's a symmetry in the evolution across those 3 records to what he does across Fear of the Dawn, Entering Heaven Alive, and No Name, where the first album represents a brusque evolution of sound. You have Blunderbuss that thrust him into the Nashville era. You have Fear of the Dawn that thrusts him into this crunchy rock era again. And then the second albums, whether it is Lazaretto or Entering Heaven Alive, they are thoughtful reflections and introspective reactions to those previous albums. They also have the most black and white on their covers. And then the third albums in this cycle are the risky, big swing explosions that feel like he's taking a monstrous creative risk and bearing his soul. And that's where you get Boarding House Reach, the most wild departure of his long and storied career, or No Name, which feels like such a risky, out there, passionate, ballsy effort from an artist where most artists, if you track them where they are in their career this many years in, they don't have that sense of struggle and turmoil. There is not that sense of striving in every note of the music, but that's still here. I would argue that No Name is, I need a sort of time to balance this statement. I've had a lot of time to think about something challenging like Boarding House Reach. But I imagine if you ask me a number of years from now, that No Name will feel like as big of a swing. And this is where I want to close out this discussion, because I am left in this sort of afterglow as we've had No Name for a while, listened to it a bunch of times, stared at that album cover a lot, looked back over the solo career. No Name has left me with that same gloriously baffled feeling that Icky Thump gave me, where I had no idea where this artist could go from here. It felt like the culmination of everything they'd been teasing or working towards. Icky Thump felt like the mountaintop for the White Stripes. And in the same way, No Name feels like the mountaintop for Jack White. It feels like that final piece has been made between the old Jack White and the new. It feels restless and relentless and passionate and wild. There's that yowling abandon that I talked about on the last episode. All of that is here, and I have no idea where it goes next. And that's what's exciting for me at this point. It's not me asking for him to return to something I've liked that he's done in the past, or, oh, what if you did something that was more White Stripesy? I cannot wait to see what he does next. And whatever it is, I'll be there. Thank you very much for joining me for this second discussion of Jack White's No Name. I think it is the most exciting project released in any medium this year. It has caught my imagination and inspired me, and I just wanted to get this out there as sort of a coda to the previous discussion. So thank you for joining me. Thank you for listening. Please, in the comments below, whether you're listening, you can comment over on our Patreon, get a bunch of bonus episodes. You can comment on YouTube. You can email us, secondbreakfastpod@gmail.com. What do you think? What spoke to you about this album, about the color theory across this solo career? What do you make of all of these provocations and puzzle pieces? This is the sort of work that we love to do here. It's digging in to works of art that speak to us and inspire us. We do it 2 or 3 times a week, depending on how much free time we have. Every Friday we go through a chapter of a book, usually a fantasy book. Right now we're doing the first Game of Thrones for deep dive literary analysis discussions. On Sundays, when we can, we do bonus episodes on Patreon. Lately we've been doing them every week, but of course, usually it's less than that. We've just been on a real tear lately. And on Tuesdays, we get these curveball episodes of any work of art in any medium that speaks to us, and we have something fun to dig into. So this one really caught my attention. Thank you very much for joining me on this journey. I tried to make it as accessible and intelligible as possible. So if you've made it to the end, you have my eternal sympathy and gratitude. And we'll be back in just a few days with another brand new episode.